What if a medical test showed that your heart was functioning like someone 60 years younger, without medication, without supplements, and without a fitness routine? At 102 years old, a Japanese fisherman recently underwent a standard cardiac stress test, the same type used worldwide to assess cardiovascular aging. The results surprised even experienced clinicians. His resting heart rate, arterial elasticity, and blood flow response matched values commonly seen in healthy men in their early 40s. There was no clinical explanation rooted in luck or rare genetics. From a medical perspective, this was a biological result that should not exist at that age. Japanese doctors reviewing the data were careful in their interpretation. This was not a miracle case, and it was not attributed to exceptional DNA. In fact, similar patterns, though rarely this extreme, have been observed in long-living populations across Japan. What made this case stand out was how clearly it illustrated a core principle of Japanese longevity medicine. The heart does not age suddenly. It ages slowly, in response to thousands of small, repeated decisions made every day over decades. In modern healthcare, heart aging is often discussed in terms of medication, cholesterol targets, or emergency intervention. But preventive medicine in Japan looks much earlier in the process. It focuses on daily food choices, metabolic stability, inflammation control, and the long-term protection of blood vessels. This fisherman's heart did not remain young because something extraordinary happened once. It remained young because nothing damaging happened repeatedly. Have you ever noticed how heart disease rarely appears overnight? It develops quietly, often starting after age 40 or 50, driven by consistent blood sugar spikes, chronic inflammation, excess calories, and poor dietary patterns. In this case, those stressors were largely absent. Year after year, his body was exposed to the same simple foods, eaten in modest portions, at consistent times. There were no cycles of extreme dieting, no reliance on longevity supplements, and no aggressive health interventions later in life. This is why Japanese longevity research places such strong emphasis on prevention rather than treatment. Healthy aging, especially aging after 50, depends less on what is added and more on what is avoided. The fisherman's medical records showed stable blood pressure, low inflammatory markers, and preserved vascular flexibility. These outcomes are closely linked to diet and daily habits, not to exercise programs or pharmaceutical routines. The Japanese diet, particularly in coastal and rural regions, is built around longevity foods that protect the cardiovascular system without overwhelming it. These foods reduce oxidative stress, stabilize blood sugar, and support arterial health over time. In this case, the doctor's analysis pointed clearly toward food-based disease prevention, not genetic protection. This aligns with broader findings in Japanese longevity studies, which repeatedly show that populations with simple, repetitive diets experience lower rates of heart disease and metabolic decline. What you're about to discover may surprise you, not because it is complex, but because it is remarkably ordinary. The habits that preserved this man's heart were not designed to extend life. They were simply how he ate every day. Stay with me because next we are going to examine the first of 3 specific foods that Japanese doctors identified as central to maintaining a young, resilient heart over a lifetime. This fisherman spent more than 8 decades working at sea, leaving shore before sunrise and returning only after hours of steady physical labor. He lived his entire life in the same small coastal village in Japan, a place where reaching old age is not unusual, but maintaining exceptional cardiovascular health past 100 is still rare. His life followed a predictable pattern shaped by work, food availability, and local customs rather than by modern health strategies. There were no abrupt lifestyle changes later in life, no reactive interventions after a diagnosis, and no periods of extreme behavior. What drew the attention of Japanese preventive medicine researchers was not his age alone, but the absence of the cardiovascular decline typically seen after age 60, even in otherwise healthy individuals. Doctors began studying him because his clinical profile did not match what decades of data usually predict. In most adults, arterial stiffness increases steadily with age, resting heart rate rises, and the heart's ability to respond efficiently to physical stress diminishes. These changes occur gradually and are strongly influenced by diet, blood sugar regulation, inflammation, and long-term metabolic stress. In this case, however, standard indicators such as heart rate variability, lipid balance, and vascular responsiveness remained within ranges associated with much younger adults. This made him a valuable subject for understanding how long-term daily decisions shape cardiovascular aging. Now I want to go deeper into this, because what researchers focused on was not a single habit or isolated factor, but the consistency of his daily choices across decades. His work as a fisherman naturally enforced regular movement without overexertion. His meals were structured around what was locally available, eaten at similar times each day, and rarely exceeded what his body required. There was no pattern of excess followed by restriction, which is important because repeated metabolic swings place stress on blood vessels and accelerate heart aging. Instead, his cardiovascular system was exposed to stable conditions year after year, allowing it to maintain functional balance. Japanese doctors also examined blood markers associated with long-term disease prevention, including indicators of chronic inflammation and glucose control. These markers often begin to deteriorate silently after age 50, even in people who feel generally healthy. In this fisherman, they remained relatively stable, suggesting that his daily food intake and energy balance avoided the cumulative damage that drives heart disease over time. This aligns with broader findings in Japanese longevity research, where consistency in diet and routine shows a stronger impact on healthy aging than short-term interventions or late-life changes. For viewers over 50, this case highlights a practical and often overlooked point. Cardiovascular decline is rarely caused by a single poor decision, just as preservation is rarely the result of a single good one. The long-term effect comes from repetition. Daily choices about portion size, food quality, meal timing, and activity level accumulate slowly but predictably. Prevention works best when the body is not forced to constantly adapt to extremes. In this fisherman's life, the absence of extremes was itself protective. Doctors were careful to note that his health was not maintained through conscious optimization. He did not track biomarkers or follow guidelines. His environment and routine naturally supported prevention by limiting excess, stabilizing metabolism, and reducing chronic stress on the cardiovascular system. This reinforces a key principle of preventive medicine. The body ages according to the conditions it experiences most often, not the ones it encounters occasionally. This case provides a clear example of how long-term patterns outweigh short-term efforts when it comes to heart health and aging. The value lies not in copying his life exactly, but in understanding how consistency and simplicity protect the cardiovascular system over decades, creating conditions where decline is delayed rather than managed after it appears. Comment: this makes sense to me. His daily routine did not include exercise as it is commonly defined today. There were no planned workouts, no elevated heart rate targets, and no periods of intense physical strain. Instead, his body was in motion from morning until late afternoon through work that required steady, low-level effort. Walking along uneven shorelines, carrying equipment, lifting and sorting nets, maintaining balance on a moving boat, and standing for long periods were all part of his normal day. This type of movement kept his muscles active and his joints mobile without placing excessive demand on the heart. From a medical perspective, this matters because the cardiovascular system responds differently to sustained light activity than it does to short bursts of intense exercise. Now I want to go deeper into this, because continuous low-intensity movement plays a direct role in preserving blood vessel health. When muscles contract gently and repeatedly throughout the day, blood flow remains steady and predictable. This constant circulation stimulates the inner lining of blood vessels, known as the endothelium, which regulates vessel dilation and blood pressure. With regular stimulation, endothelial cells maintain their ability to respond efficiently, keeping arteries flexible rather than rigid. In contrast, long periods of sitting reduce blood flow and allow vascular stiffness to increase, especially after age 50. Another important factor is insulin sensitivity. Low-level movement helps muscles absorb glucose from the bloodstream without requiring large spikes in insulin. Over time, this reduces the risk of insulin resistance, a condition strongly associated with cardiovascular disease. In this fisherman's routine, movement was distributed evenly across the day rather than concentrated into a single session. This pattern prevented large swings in blood sugar and minimized metabolic stress. The long-term effect of this consistency is a cardiovascular system that experiences fewer inflammatory triggers and less cumulative damage. For adults over 50, this distinction is especially relevant. Many people attempt to compensate for long hours of inactivity with short periods of intense exercise. While structured exercise has benefits, it does not fully offset the impact of prolonged sitting. Research consistently shows that frequent light movement throughout the day has a stronger preventive impact on vascular health than isolated workouts alone. This fisherman's routine naturally avoided the problem of extended inactivity, which is one of the primary drivers of arterial stiffness with aging. His work also required balance, coordination, and controlled strength rather than repetitive strain. These movements activated multiple muscle groups simultaneously, promoting efficient circulation without elevating heart rate excessively. This reduced wear on the heart while still maintaining cardiovascular responsiveness. Over decades, this pattern allowed the heart to function efficiently without being repeatedly pushed into high-stress states. Prevention in this context did not come from pushing the body harder, but from keeping it consistently engaged. The practical relevance here lies in daily decisions rather than structured plans. Frequent walking, standing instead of sitting when possible, light lifting, and regular changes in posture all create a similar physiological effect. Avoiding long, uninterrupted sitting periods is particularly important, as even brief movement breaks can restore blood flow and reduce vascular strain. These small actions accumulate, and their impact becomes more pronounced with age. What stands out medically is that this routine required no conscious effort to improve health. It worked because it was repeated daily, year after year, creating a stable environment for the cardiovascular system. The absence of extremes allowed the heart and blood vessels to age more slowly, preserving function through consistent, low-level demand. Comment: I'm starting with one change. His diet followed the structure of traditional coastal Japanese eating patterns, shaped by availability, seasonality, and repetition rather than by nutritional theory. Most meals were built around small fish, seaweed, vegetables, fermented foods, and rice, prepared simply and eaten in modest amounts. Fish was not treated as a centerpiece in large portions, but as a regular component consumed several times per week. It was typically grilled or simmered, methods that preserve nutrients without adding oxidized fats. Fried foods were uncommon, and highly processed ingredients were largely absent. From a medical standpoint, this type of diet places very little inflammatory burden on the cardiovascular system over time. Now I want to go deeper into this, because the protective effect of this diet is not based on one single food, but on how these foods work together repeatedly over decades. Small fish are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which play a critical role in reducing vascular inflammation. Chronic inflammation is one of the main drivers of arterial damage and plaque formation, especially after age 50. Omega-3s help stabilize the inner lining of blood vessels, improve blood flow, and reduce the tendency for clot formation. When consumed regularly in moderate amounts, they support long-term cardiovascular function without overstimulating the system. Seaweed and vegetables contributed a steady intake of minerals, fiber, and antioxidants. These nutrients support blood pressure regulation and help maintain healthy blood vessel tone. Fiber also slows glucose absorption after meals, reducing blood sugar spikes that damage arteries over time. In this fisherman's case, vegetables were eaten daily, often prepared simply and without heavy sauces. This consistency helped maintain metabolic stability, which is essential for disease prevention as the body ages. Fermented foods played a quieter but equally important role. Items such as fermented vegetables or naturally fermented soybean products provided beneficial bacteria that support gut health. The gut microbiome has a direct influence on cardiovascular health through its impact on inflammation, lipid metabolism, and blood pressure regulation. Research shows that balanced gut bacteria can help lower systolic blood pressure and reduce inflammatory markers associated with heart disease. Unlike processed salty foods, these fermented items deliver flavor without overwhelming sodium levels, allowing salt intake to remain controlled. Rice served as a stable carbohydrate source, providing energy without excess. Portions were moderate, and rice was typically paired with protein and vegetables, which slowed digestion and prevented sharp glucose spikes. This balance is particularly relevant for adults over 50, as glucose regulation becomes less efficient with age. By avoiding refined sugars and oversized portions, the diet reduced insulin demand and protected vascular function over the long term. What is notable medically is not that these foods are unique, but that they were consumed consistently and without variation driven by trends. There were no cycles of restriction and indulgence, and no reliance on supplements to correct dietary imbalances. Daily choices were simple, predictable, and repeated year after year. This allowed the cardiovascular system to operate under stable conditions, minimizing cumulative damage. For practical application, the impact lies in frequency rather than intensity. Prioritizing fish 2 to 3 times per week provides sufficient omega-3 intake to support heart health. Including one fermented food daily can help maintain gut balance and support blood pressure control. These decisions do not require drastic change, but they do require consistency. The long-term effect of these patterns is a reduction in inflammatory stress placed on the heart and blood vessels. From a preventive medicine perspective, this diet demonstrates how ordinary foods, prepared simply and eaten regularly, can shape cardiovascular outcomes over a lifetime. It creates a nutritional environment where the heart is supported rather than challenged, allowing normal aging processes to slow without intervention. Comment: this makes sense to me. One of the most consistent patterns observed in this fisherman's daily life was not what he ate, but how much he ate. Meals were modest, regular, and ended before the sensation of fullness appeared. This was not a conscious restriction or a response to weight concerns, but a habitual way of eating that remained unchanged for decades. Medical testing showed that his blood glucose levels remained remarkably stable after meals, with no sharp spikes or prolonged elevations. For preventive medicine, this is a critical observation, because repeated post-meal glucose surges are a major contributor to vascular damage and accelerated heart aging, particularly after age 50. Now I want to go deeper into this, because portion size directly influences how the cardiovascular system ages over time. When meals are consistently large, the body is forced to manage repeated metabolic overload. Blood sugar rises sharply, insulin levels increase, and inflammatory pathways are activated. Over years, this cycle damages the inner lining of blood vessels, promoting stiffness, plaque formation, and reduced elasticity. Even when food quality is relatively good, chronic overeating places unnecessary strain on the heart and arteries. In contrast, smaller portions reduce the metabolic load placed on the body after each meal, allowing blood vessels to recover rather than deteriorate. In this fisherman's case, eating to about 80% fullness meant digestion remained efficient and predictable. The stomach was not overstretched, and the hormonal signals that regulate appetite and glucose control were not repeatedly disrupted. This pattern supported insulin sensitivity, which is essential for maintaining healthy blood vessels. Stable insulin response helps prevent the low-grade inflammation that quietly damages the cardiovascular system over time. For adults aged 50 and older, preserving insulin sensitivity becomes increasingly important, as the body's ability to regulate glucose naturally declines with age. Meal timing also played a role. Meals were eaten earlier in the day and rarely extended late into the evening. Avoiding late-night eating reduces prolonged elevation of blood sugar and insulin during sleep, a period when the body is meant to recover rather than digest. From a medical perspective, late-night overeating interferes with circadian regulation of metabolism and increases cardiovascular stress. By keeping meals predictable and allowing adequate time between the last meal and sleep, the body maintains better hormonal balance and vascular health. The long-term effect of these daily choices is cumulative. One smaller meal does not protect the heart, just as one large meal does not cause disease. The impact comes from consistency. Repeated day after day, modest portions prevent chronic metabolic stress and allow the cardiovascular system to operate within stable parameters. This fisherman's eating pattern created an environment where blood vessels were rarely exposed to damaging extremes, reducing the gradual where that typically accelerates heart aging. For practical application, this does not require calorie counting or strict rules. Ending meals slightly before feeling full is a simple adjustment that can significantly reduce cardiovascular strain. Paying attention to portion size, eating at regular times, and avoiding late-night meals are decisions that support prevention without complexity. These habits are especially relevant for viewers over 50, as the margin for metabolic stress narrows with age. From a clinical standpoint, the absence of overeating in this fisherman's life removed one of the most common drivers of heart disease. It demonstrates how controlling quantity, not just quality, of food plays a central role in preserving vascular health over decades. This pattern of eating sets the physiological conditions needed for the heart to remain efficient and resilient as aging continues, allowing the explanation to move forward naturally. Comment: this makes sense to me. Another pattern that stood out clearly in this fisherman's life was the consistency of his daily schedule. He woke with daylight, began work shortly after, ate his meals at nearly identical times each day, and went to sleep soon after sunset. This routine remained stable for decades, largely unaffected by seasons, age, or external demands. When Japanese doctors evaluated his hormonal markers, they found that his cortisol levels followed a predictable daily curve and his heart rate variability remained stable, even at an advanced age. From a medical perspective, this indicates a nervous system and cardiovascular system that are under minimal chronic stress. Now I want to go deeper into this, because circadian consistency plays a direct and often underestimated role in cardiovascular health. The body operates on internal clocks that regulate hormone release, blood pressure, heart rate, digestion, and inflammatory response. When these rhythms are disrupted by irregular sleep and meal timing, the cardiovascular system is forced to adapt repeatedly. Over time, this constant adjustment increases stress hormones, promotes inflammation, and accelerates vascular aging. In contrast, a stable daily schedule allows these systems to function predictably, reducing strain on the heart and blood vessels. Cortisol is a key example. This hormone naturally rises in the morning to support alertness and gradually declines throughout the day. In people with irregular schedules, cortisol often remains elevated into the evening, increasing blood pressure and interfering with nighttime recovery. In this fisherman, cortisol followed a consistent pattern, rising and falling at appropriate times. This reduced unnecessary cardiovascular stimulation and allowed the heart to spend more time in a recovery state. Stable cortisol rhythms are strongly associated with lower rates of hypertension and heart disease, particularly after age 50. Heart rate variability, another marker doctors observed, reflects how well the heart responds to changes in demand. Higher variability generally indicates better autonomic balance and cardiovascular resilience. Disrupted sleep and inconsistent routines reduce this variability, signaling chronic stress on the heart. The fisherman's consistent schedule supported a balanced nervous system, allowing his heart to adjust efficiently without being overstimulated. Over decades, this stability contributed to preserved cardiovascular function. Meal timing also reinforced these effects. Eating at the same times each day helps synchronize metabolic processes with circadian rhythms. When meals are irregular or late at night, glucose and insulin responses become less efficient, increasing inflammatory stress. In this case, predictable meal timing supported stable blood sugar regulation and reduced metabolic strain. For adults over 50, whose metabolic flexibility naturally declines, this regularity becomes even more important for disease prevention. Sleep timing completed the cycle. Going to bed shortly after sunset aligns sleep with natural light exposure, supporting melatonin release and nighttime cardiovascular recovery. Sleep is when blood pressure drops and inflammatory processes are suppressed. Irregular sleep schedules blunt these effects, leaving the cardiovascular system in a semi-activated state. By maintaining consistent sleep timing, the fisherman allowed his heart and blood vessels to recover fully each night. The long-term effect of this routine is not dramatic in the short term, but it is powerful over decades. Consistent daily choices regarding sleep and meals reduce cumulative cardiovascular stress. These decisions do not require effort or optimization, only repetition. For practical application, keeping fixed sleep and meal times, even on weekends, helps stabilize hormonal and nervous system function. This creates conditions where the heart is exposed to fewer stress signals and more recovery time. From a preventive medicine standpoint, circadian consistency acts as a quiet stabilizer of cardiovascular health. It reduces inflammation, supports vascular flexibility, and preserves autonomic balance as aging progresses. This stable internal environment allows other protective habits to have their full impact as the explanation continues. Comment: I'm starting with one change. An important distinction in this fisherman's life was not the absence of stress, but the way stress appeared and resolved. Fishing involves real risk, physical uncertainty, and moments that require immediate attention. Weather changes, equipment problems, and the demands of working at sea all create acute stress. However, These stressors occurred in short, defined bursts and were followed by long periods of recovery. Once the workday ended, there was no continuation of urgency, no replaying of events, and no constant mental stimulation. From a medical perspective, this pattern is fundamentally different from the chronic psychological stress experienced by many adults today. Now I want to go deeper into this, because the cardiovascular system responds very differently to acute stress compared to chronic stress. Acute stress triggers a temporary increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. When followed by adequate recovery, this response can actually strengthen cardiovascular resilience. Blood vessels learn to constrict and relax efficiently, and the heart adapts to short-term demands without sustaining damage. This process is similar to how muscles respond to brief exertion followed by rest. The key factor is that the stress response fully resolves. Chronic stress, on the other hand, keeps the body in a state of constant activation. Cortisol remains elevated, blood pressure stays higher than necessary, and inflammation gradually increases. Over time, this damages the inner lining of blood vessels, reduces heart rate variability, and accelerates arterial stiffness. In adults over 50, the ability to recover from prolonged stress is reduced, making chronic exposure particularly harmful. In this fisherman's case, the absence of ongoing psychological pressure allowed his cardiovascular system to return to baseline repeatedly, preventing cumulative damage. Another relevant aspect was the lack of multitasking. His work demanded focus on a single task at a time, followed by clear periods of rest. There was no constant switching of attention, no continuous alerts, and no digital stimulation extending into the evening. Modern research shows that continuous low-level mental stress, often driven by digital devices, keeps the nervous system in a semi-activated state. This prevents full cardiovascular recovery, even during sleep. By contrast, clear boundaries between work and rest supported a balanced autonomic nervous system in this fisherman. The impact of this pattern becomes more significant with age. As people grow older, the cardiovascular system becomes less tolerant of prolonged stress signals. Recovery time increases, and chronic activation leads more quickly to hypertension and heart disease. Short, defined stress followed by recovery remains manageable, while constant background stress does not. The fisherman's daily structure naturally limited stress duration, allowing recovery to occur consistently. For practical application, the focus is not on eliminating stress, which is neither realistic nor necessary. The focus is on reducing constant stimulation and building clear work-rest boundaries. Limiting digital exposure outside of work hours, avoiding multitasking when possible, and allowing periods of true mental disengagement help restore normal stress hormone patterns. These daily choices reduce unnecessary cardiovascular strain and support long-term prevention. From a medical standpoint, stress becomes damaging not because it exists, but because it does not end. This fisherman's life demonstrates how acute stress paired with recovery strengthens resilience, while chronic stress erodes it. Maintaining this balance allows the heart and blood vessels to respond to demands without remaining under constant pressure, setting conditions that support continued cardiovascular stability as aging progresses. Comment: This makes sense to me. Another factor doctors paid close attention to was his social structure. This fisherman did not live in isolation, nor did his relationships change frequently over time. He remained in the same coastal community for most of his life, working alongside the same people, sharing meals regularly, and maintaining predictable social contact day after day. These interactions were not formal or planned as health behaviors, but they were consistent and stable. When Japanese doctors reviewed his inflammatory markers, they found lower levels commonly associated with social isolation and chronic loneliness, conditions that are now recognized as independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now I want to go deeper into this, because social connection has a measurable biological impact on heart health. Human interaction directly influences the nervous system, particularly the balance between stress-related sympathetic activity and recovery-related parasympathetic activity. Regular, familiar social contact lowers baseline cortisol levels and supports healthier heart rate variability. This creates a cardiovascular environment where blood pressure regulation and vascular tone remain more stable. In contrast, social isolation is associated with sustained activation of stress pathways, even in the absence of obvious psychological distress. In this fisherman's case, social interaction was built into daily life rather than treated as a separate activity. Shared meals encouraged regular eating patterns and reduced the likelihood of overeating or irregular schedules. Working with the same people reduced uncertainty and cognitive stress, allowing the nervous system to remain in a calmer baseline state. These conditions supported prevention by limiting unnecessary hormonal fluctuations that contribute to inflammation and vascular damage over time. Medical research consistently shows that adults over 50 who experience chronic loneliness have higher rates of hypertension, elevated inflammatory markers, and reduced heart rate variability. These changes occur even when diet and physical activity are otherwise adequate. This suggests that social structure is not simply a quality of life factor, but a physiological one. The fisherman's stable social environment acted as a protective buffer, reducing the long-term cardiovascular impact of stress and aging. Another important aspect was predictability. His social interactions were not sporadic or demanding. There was no constant pressure to form new connections or manage complex social dynamics. Instead, relationships were familiar and repetitive, which reduced cognitive load. This predictability allowed the nervous system to operate efficiently, conserving energy for physical recovery and cardiovascular maintenance. Over decades, this contributed to lower inflammatory stress and better vascular function. For practical application, this highlights that regular social interaction is not optional for heart health. It does not require large gatherings or constant engagement. Simple, repeated contact with familiar people is sufficient to support nervous system regulation. Shared meals, routine conversations, and consistent work or community involvement all contribute to cardiovascular protection. These daily choices reduce the physiological strain associated with isolation, especially as aging increases vulnerability to stress-related damage. From a preventive medicine perspective, social structure acts as a stabilizing factor that supports other healthy behaviors. It reinforces routine, reduces chronic stress signals, and helps maintain hormonal balance. This fisherman's experience demonstrates that long-term cardiovascular protection is shaped not only by food and movement, but also by the social environment in which daily life unfolds. Comment: this makes sense to me. When Japanese longevity medicine evaluates cases like this, it does not start with genetics as the primary explanation. While genetic factors influence baseline risk, preventive medicine in Japan consistently shows that genetics alone cannot account for preserved cardiovascular function at extreme ages. In this case, doctors emphasized that the fisherman's heart health reflected cumulative daily habits that maintained vascular flexibility, metabolic balance, and stable stress regulation over an entire lifetime. These factors interact continuously, shaping how the cardiovascular system ages year after year rather than determining outcomes at birth. Now I want to go deeper into this, because the medical conclusion challenges a common assumption about aging. Heart aging is often treated as an unavoidable process that accelerates regardless of behavior after midlife. Japanese preventive research shows a different pattern. Blood vessels respond dynamically to daily conditions. When exposed repeatedly to stable blood sugar levels, low inflammation, predictable stress responses, and consistent recovery, vascular tissue retains elasticity far longer than expected. In contrast, when daily conditions include frequent glucose spikes, chronic stress hormones, irregular sleep, and metabolic overload, arterial stiffening accelerates, even in individuals without strong genetic risk. From a biological perspective, the heart and blood vessels remodel themselves continuously. Endothelial cells respond to blood flow patterns, inflammatory signals, and hormonal balance. Smooth muscle cells in arteries adapt to repeated stress or stability. Over decades, these small adaptations accumulate into measurable differences in arterial stiffness, blood pressure regulation, and cardiac efficiency. The fisherman's daily choices created conditions that favored preservation rather than deterioration. This is why Japanese doctors describe heart aging as largely behavioral rather than predetermined. Another important conclusion from Japanese longevity medicine is that prevention operates quietly. There is no single threshold where health is suddenly protected. Instead, the long-term effect emerges from consistency. Each day of stable behavior slightly reduces cumulative damage. Over years, this translates into preserved function. This explains why late-life interventions often struggle to reverse cardiovascular decline. They are attempting to correct decades of accumulated stress rather than preventing it from occurring. For adults over 50, this conclusion is particularly relevant. While some age-related changes are unavoidable, the rate at which they progress is strongly influenced by daily decisions. Maintaining metabolic balance, supporting vascular flexibility, and regulating stress responses remain possible well into later decades of life. Japanese preventive medicine does not suggest perfection or strict control. It emphasizes reducing repeated harm. Fewer extremes, fewer disruptions, and fewer inflammatory triggers allow the cardiovascular system to age more slowly. Doctors reviewing this case also noted that none of the protective factors operated in isolation. Diet supported metabolic stability, movement maintained vascular responsiveness, routine stabilized hormonal rhythms, and social structure reduced chronic stress. Together, these elements formed a consistent internal environment. This reinforces a central medical insight. Heart health reflects the conditions it experiences most often, not occasional efforts or isolated changes. The key insight is not that this fisherman followed a special program, but that his life avoided patterns known to accelerate cardiovascular aging. Japanese longevity medicine views this as evidence that aging trajectories are shaped gradually and predictably. When daily choices support prevention, the heart retains functional capacity far longer than commonly assumed. This understanding creates a clear framework for how cardiovascular health can be preserved as aging continues. Comment: this makes sense to me. What ultimately stands out in this case is not complexity, innovation, or adherence to health trends, but consistency. This 102-year-old fisherman did not adjust his habits in response to new information or changing advice. He repeated the same basic behaviors day after day, allowing their impact to accumulate gradually. From a medical perspective, this is why his cardiovascular system retained function so late in life. The heart responds not to intention, but to exposure. What it experiences most often shapes how it ages. Now I want to go deeper into this, because Japanese longevity medicine views these final lessons not as recommendations, but as patterns that reliably influence biological outcomes. Daily movement, even at low intensity, maintains blood flow and vascular responsiveness. Simple eating patterns reduce metabolic stress and inflammation. Stopping meals before fullness prevents repeated glucose overload. Sleeping on a regular schedule stabilizes hormonal rhythms. Limiting chronic stress protects the nervous system and blood vessels. None of these behaviors are dramatic on their own, but their long-term effect is measurable and predictable. For adults over 50, this perspective is especially important. At this stage of life, the cardiovascular system becomes less tolerant of extremes and more responsive to consistency. Large changes are often difficult to sustain, and short-term efforts rarely translate into lasting physiological improvement. In contrast, small, repeatable daily choices reduce cumulative damage. Prevention works not by doing more, but by doing less harm over time. This fisherman's life illustrates how avoiding repeated stressors allows normal aging processes to slow without intervention. Among all the habits discussed, one stands out as particularly accessible and effective: adding a daily walk after meals. From a biological standpoint, post-meal walking improves glucose uptake by muscles, reducing the blood sugar spikes that damage blood vessels. It also supports digestion, enhances circulation, and reinforces circadian rhythms when done at consistent times. Even short walks create a meaningful reduction in metabolic stress when practiced regularly. This single habit reflects the broader principle of movement without strain and consistency without complexity. The impact of such a habit does not depend on duration or intensity. What matters is repetition. A brief walk after each meal, sustained over months and years, supports vascular flexibility and insulin sensitivity. For many people, this is more realistic and sustainable than structured exercise programs. It aligns with the way the fisherman lived, integrating movement into daily life rather than isolating it as a separate task. These final lessons are not meant to replace medical care or suggest guaranteed outcomes. They reflect how the body responds to stable conditions over time. Japanese preventive medicine emphasizes that heart aging is influenced by behavior because behavior determines the internal environment the heart must adapt to. When daily choices reduce inflammation, stabilize metabolism, and allow recovery, the cardiovascular system retains function longer. This approach does not require monitoring, optimization, or constant adjustment. It requires attention to patterns and a willingness to repeat simple behaviors consistently. That is where its strength lies. By focusing on what can be done daily without disruption, it creates conditions that support long-term cardiovascular health as aging continues, allowing the understanding of longevity to extend naturally from here. Comment: I'm starting with one change. If you've stayed with this explanation to the end, it likely means this approach to health feels practical and grounded to you. This channel focuses on how Japanese longevity research, daily food habits, and preventive medicine shape healthy aging in a way that is realistic and evidence-based. If that's the kind of information you want more of, subscribing simply keeps these discussions available to you as new topics are added. If the breakdown was useful, you can leave a comment saying, "I watched till the end." It helps show that this type of clear, practical content is worth continuing. You can also leave a like as a simple signal that the explanation delivered value. There's a video here that complements what we discussed today, expanding naturally on how daily habits influence long-term health. You can continue from there when you're ready.